Everyone out there on the live stream, thank you for being here. We're just about to get started. So throw some comments into the chat and we'll try to make that part of the show. So you guys ready?
Yep.
Yeah, let's do it.
Carlton, Will, welcome to Talk Python to me. Again, welcome back, guys.
Well, thank you for having us. You came on
thank
our
you.
show, though.
Yeah, you came on our show and I was on your show 3 years ago. So Carlton's first time on your show.
Yeah.
Talk Python newbie.
Yeah, it was great to have you on the show before, Will, and we talked about Django then, and I suspect it won't surprise people with you and Carlton here that we may touch on Django.
I think we've got to talk about Django a little bit. No?
A little bit.
Carlton, tell people who you are.
Okay, so I'm Carlton. I'm Django fellow. So what that means is I help to maintain the framework. A framework the size of you've got me on Twitter there. So I'm Carlton Gibson on Twitter and on GitHub and numerous other places probably. But a framework the size of Django's, it just simply doesn't get maintained on purely volunteer effort. So there's a body called the Django Software Foundation, which Will's on the board for. He can tell you a bit about that in a second. But they are a charitable foundation which they collect money from donations from GitHub sponsors, and you can donate on djangoproject.com. And then the main thing they do is they contract the fellows, which is myself and Maris Feliciak, who's my colleague now. And we do that. I don't know, what do? We triage the tickets. We do pull request review. We do handle security issues. We handle the releases, not least the alpha releases today. So literally today, we released Django 3.2 alpha 1.
Oh, which will fantastic. Is that the very first 3.2 release?
Yeah, that's the first one. So that's like, if you've got a Django project and you've got CI, you download it now and you run it on your CI and you tell us all the things we broke. better before we release the final. It's much better during the alpha pre-release period than just after 3.2 final. You go, hey, everything's broken.
Yeah, you really need people to test it now before it's too late, right?
Yeah, but it's quite exciting because the last couple of weeks have been building towards the feature free. So the alpha marks the feature free. So the beat over the pre-release period now will merge bug fixes in the new features. So anything that people find and report will fix and get out before the final. But there's no new features going into 3.2. So on Thursday just gone, I branched the stable branch for 3.2, which will be, that's Django 3.2, and it will be that for the next 3 years because the long-term release gets, quite the long-term support release, which 3.2 gets 3 years of support.
Yeah, that's really great. All right, we're going to definitely have to come back to that, but also welcome, Will. Tell everyone.
Oh yeah, there I am.
Real briefly, you were on the show a while ago, and we talked. I believe it was learning Django we spoke about, right?
I loved in Django at the time, so I'd written, I think, a couple books. So I have 3 books: Django for professionals and APIs, and the last 2 years I've been a member of the Django Software Foundation board. So there's about 2 who are voted in, who play a prominent role in the community one way or another, and then the board is 7 people annually voted on who manage Django itself, which is a nonprofit. Talk about that later. So yeah, I have now a website, learndjango.com, which is an online version of educational content. But in addition to having a podcast with Carlton, Django Chat, since he's a fellow, which is contracted by the board, we have another touch point, as if we didn't need more.
Exactly. Yeah. So I was on your show a while ago, and that was super fun. I really enjoyed our conversation there. And, maybe just tell people quickly about your podcast. What kind of stuff do you cover there? Obviously Django, but, where do they find it? What do they cover?
Okay, so we get people on from the community. It's kind of an interview type basis. We get someone on. It's fortnightly now. We were doing it every week, but we not like you, Michael. We can't keep it up forever. So we've gone fortnightly, which has taken a bit of pressure off with COVID and the kids off school and all of that. But we get people who've contributed to Django or people who are using Django in their business, and we talk about it. So it's Django Chat. It's chatting about Django.
It's chatting about Django, yeah.
Yeah. It's chatdjango.com.
And it's also, I think, recreating a little bit of what you would have at a DjangoCon event. So these are annual events. So we started after I went to my first DjangoCon and met Carlton and was like, why can't I talk to people about Django more often? And at the time, there wasn't a Django podcast. So yeah, we've gotten to interview really my dream list of guests. I mean, we had actually, I was just talking to someone else who works at Stripe, which is still running on Sinatra, which is a Ruby thing, and I was like, yeah, I've talked to DHH because he's came on our show. So we talked about Rails versus Django. We had Carl Meyer on, who's at Instagram, was formerly Django Core. Basically everyone, almost everyone we'd want to talk to who's involved in Django is willing to come on and share their story. I think it's a really nice connector and educational for us too.
I do as well. And just sort of a sidebar for our show here, being all of us fellow podcasters, I think it's really interesting the role that podcasts play in keeping connections to the broader tech community when we can't go anywhere. I mean, even if you weren't typically going to conferences or meetups, you could still go to work and see other people, right? It's for me, it took at first when COVID hit, I was like, I'm not traveling anywhere. I'm not taking my kid to school or anything like that. So there's no like natural place here. I'm stuck for 45 minutes. I'm going to just listen. But as it's drawn on, I started to listen to shows, especially with multiple people trying to, it brings sort of a normalcy and I get to kind of hang out with these people, even though they don't respond to me. I still get to hang out with them. And I think that's a really interesting societal thing that's happening right now.
Yeah, I think it's beneficial across the board. I mean, probably like you all, I listen to podcasts outside of tech as well. And it's sort of like people I'd want to sit in on their conversations anyways. So for me, it's probably my primary media consumption aside from books.
Yeah.
But I mean, I'm not reading ancient Greek like Carlton. Carlton has a PhD and all that. So by comparison, my habits are... yeah, but we should. I mean, I think we were going to talk about deployments.
Book is too lowbrow,
Yeah. We were going to talk about specifically deployments on Django. I mean, we can go on and on about obviously all the intricacies of Django, but I think suffice to say, I'm an educator on the board, and Carlton's a fellow, so he makes the releases happen, including 3.2 alpha, which just dropped today. And I guess you mentioned LTS, so that's confusing to non-Django people. So since having fellows like Carlton, Django has a pretty rapid release cycle where it's every 9 months or so. So there was 3.0, 3.1, 3.2 this December. I think Carlton is 4.0.
Yep.
And then every one of those is a long-term service release. So that will last 2.5 years. So if that is it 3 years? Yeah, it's on. There's a link on the Django project site. So that's a way so Django doesn't really have. It's rare to have breaking changes these days, but the LTS is designed to help people who can't keep up with that cycle stay up to date. Though we have a lot of podcasts and opinions about why you should always stay up to date, and it's worth it. Yeah, because that's one of the most fair things you can do. Because as Carlton mentioned, there's bug fixes constantly. So there's 3.1.1, 3.1.2. There'll be 3.2, then the 3.2.1 a month later or so. So stay up to date if you can.
I'm a big advocate of, if you possibly can get on the latest major release. So hanging out historically, the long-term release was really the LTS release was really important because there were breaking changes, right? In each major version of Django, there were new things and it was difficult to keep, but that's not the case anymore. It's really easy to update. So I'm a big advocate of that. Now, and then when I talk to fellow people in the Django community, they're like, well, I work in the real world and you can't always keep up on the latest major version. So for those folks, then, the LTS is a really good option because it's once every 3 years, it's coming. You get a 6-month window of overlap of support. So the old LTS gets 6 months of security release after the release of the new LTS, and that's your window to update.
Well, I think that running and maintaining software built upon frameworks like Django, it falls into two categories for me. It falls into, here's something that we have a team or at least somebody dedicated to owning this project and we care about its ongoing life. And then we have the ones that are oh, please don't touch it. And the oh, please don't touch it is we've long since stopped developing that. Maybe the person who developed it left, but it's still important and we don't want to break it. It's working right now, but if you touch it and you break it, you've now adopted it. You know what I mean? Like it's that thing that just,
it's like if you break the build.
Yes, but worse because it's legacy build, right? It's like, so to me, I feel like that please don't touch it side, the LTS makes perfect sense for them.
Yeah, entirely. The way I like to think of it is this a thing that you're feasibly going to add new features to? And if you're feasibly going to add new features to, then you should be on the latest major version. And because it's once every 8 months, you need to allocate a day or two to keep up to, fix up, download the new version, run the test suite, see the deprecation warnings, fix the deprecation warnings. Maybe you have to wait a couple of weeks for a dependency to update, and then you can push forward. And that's once every 8 months, that process. And if you're adding new features, if it's a live project, ideally you'd be there. But yes, if there's something which you just need to keep running for the long run, you could do that much less frequently.
Right. But it allows people who have that, please don't touch it. But, there's a security problem. If there's no LTS and there's a security problem, then not only do they have to figure out how to redeploy the fix, they've got to say, well, we didn't touch it for 3 years and it doesn't quite work the same. So then you get into the discussion of, well, what's the risk? Will they really? It's just Java Swing. I mean, come on, what's the problem, right? How bad could that go with, like the entire world's credit
technical debt, isn't it? I mean, especially now that we're in Python 3 world, Django was part of that. It's really beyond the security thing. It's also all the ecosystem around Django, the third-party packages. Like a lot of times, if you look at their project that says, I can't update, why can't you update? They did two things. They're using a third package, which falls into that, touch it, you broke it situation. Or they did something custom at one point. They went off the guardrails and, the bill comes due. I mean, it's so tempting. Actually, I want to, speaking of going off the guardrails, a quick note that Django just passed Flask on 10 stars, which is a really poor metric of popularity, but nonetheless, we'll take it. Because Flask,
congratulations,
Flask
that's awesome.
is very easy to, spin up a couple API endpoints and boom, you're using Flask. That's a very different thing. That's like, as DHH would say, that's a Lego versus the Lego truck that is a framework like Django. And anecdotally, a lot of places use Flask, but in terms of a big site that's all Flask, that's much less common than all Django.
Yeah. Well, I was thinking about this morning, and the Flask and Django are pretty neck and neck in terms of popularity, right? They're not
on GitHub.
On GitHub, yeah, sure. There's these metrics and popularity. They're like all over the map. So one of the thoughts I had though is the people that use Flask, and this is not a knock against Flask. I like it, but one of my sort of impressions is, if I just need to, like you said, just create a couple APIs and we're just going to get something going real small and simple and just roll. Like, those people are not as invested in the ecosystem and the framework as I feel like the Django folks are. I feel like the Django folks, it's a more encompassing part of their development experience and their development lifecycle. Like, Django feels more part of the project when people adopt it and love it.
Yeah.
I don't know. What do you guys think about that?
Yeah, I mean,
it has to be, right? You need a dozen apps to use Flask, and actually, I hope that we get David Lord on to talk about Flask, because he's at DjangoCons. I mean, it's not a I don't mean to say there's a competition between the two, but serve different purposes. I would say, Carlton, right?
Yeah, different styles as well. Like, if you want to put together something, why not Flask? But I mean, I've been using Django for so long now that even if I just need to spin up 2 endpoints, it's much quicker for me to do that in Django than it is to go and get a supposedly micro framework and work out, how am I supposed to use this?
In fact, you have a whole talk on this, Carlton, I think, from DjangoCon.
DjangoCon US.
Last year. Actually, we could put the link in the notes. I made up a repo with the code, because you didn't provide code. You can
fit it on the slide, so you can just get the slide.
Oh yeah. Well, I think I tweaked a couple things, but yeah, you can have a single file Django project same way you can for Flask, because a lot of times that hello world comparison will lead people to assume that Flask is much less complicated than Django, and it's a little bit less, but it's more around to how it's structured, which is the point of Carlton's talk
Yeah, so
basically.
the talk was called "How to Using Django as a Micro Framework" or something like that, and it was about the base HTTP handlers, the kind of that real core of the framework. And those,
Right.
I put up a few examples from different frameworks, from like Flask and Node example, and Starlet, the async micro framework from Tom Christie. And then
Yeah.
I
So for
showed how you
people
might
who,
put that together in
sorry,
Django.
for people who don't necessarily live and breathe the web stuff like the three of us do,
Yeah, right.
give them a quick definition of micro framework before you go on.
Well, in the talk, I was like, well, what is a micro framework? And I think the
Yeah,
answer
I'm asking you
is
because I don't want to put my foot out there.
right. But the answer I came up with was it's got a great hello world, right?
Yeah. Okay. Sure.
like it's just a term. But I think the idea is that it's easier to contrast it with like Rails or Django. Rails and Django, they come with the batteries included, with everything you need. You've got
an ORM, you've
or
got database,
Active
you've got
Record,
migrations, all that stuff.
you've
Yeah.
got all those stuff. Whereas your micro framework, you perhaps get the core HTTP handling, and that's about it. And then you have to go and find a forms library. Okay, I found a forms library, and then you have to pull in an ORM or a database of that. Okay, I'll use that one, and so there are Node full batteries included frameworks. Like Happy is very good. It's got everything you need. But like the classic Node example is, I get Express and I pull in this thing for passing URLs and that thing. So there's a continuum. But micro frameworks fit more towards that. You put the pieces together yourself. Whereas a batteries included framework like Django, you get not everything, but a lot in the box.
Right. So your experience is more Django pieces, Django building blocks than a little Flask, a little SQL Alchemy, a little this, a little that.
Yeah.
So
no, definitely. And I've been doing it so long now that I'd struggle to break out of that. I just I throw in a bit of Starlet or a bit of Fast API, see what's going on with the new frameworks. Every new framework that comes out, I'll always give it a run. And then my question is, well, what can we learn from that for Django?
Yeah. I think
but
what
if
you
it's
can learn
really
from
large,
it's going to be interesting. Yeah. Good, Will.
I should say it's really large site. If you ask them like what language and framework do you use, it's like everything. I mean, just because of the needs of a massive site, it ends up being, it's hard to say that it's truly one thing. I mean, Instagram still has pieces of Django in it, but it's at that scale, it's its own thing. And I think the micro frameworks are really good for doing that. There's also this might be a pessimistic take, but I've heard people make that a micro framework allows you to switch the complexity from individual developers who maybe and you just as much up to your upper level, because they only can touch a tiny part of the monolith, so they can in a way do less damage. That's actually like an organizational argument for micro frameworks, is that only the software architects or the senior people fit it all together.
They weave the pieces, or they build the puzzle or whatever. Yeah.
That, I guess, especially if your testing suite isn't as good as it could be.
Yeah, I don't know. I think there's an interesting conversation about like monolith type software styles versus not. I'm actually a big fan of the monolith style. Like all my attempts to break it into little pieces, at least in the microservices, which is not the same as micro framework, but I always feel like I've quadrupled my deployment complexity to half my software complexity, and I'd rather manage half as much software complexity as twice as much deployment
complexity.
Discipline,
right? Like if you were part of a 5-person team in a large organization assigned to fix something, and you're just like, there's no way we can get it done within this monolith, but like, we could spin something up and solve the problem and move on. Apply that by a lot. I think or in an individual project, you get fancy and you customize Django, or you use a third-party package that is out of date, or maybe you shouldn't use, and they have the same issue.
Yeah. Well, I don't know. Like, okay, we're segueing slightly back into the deployment topic, which ostensibly we came to talk about. But
yeah.
Like I think the thing with microservices, right? So if you've got a massive corporation, you can't have all the things going on, right, in one team. So you need to segment it somehow, and then you can define service boundaries, and it starts to make sense. But then all the tech blogs become about microservices and how this is the way, and then learners come along and they're like, well, I've got to build my thing using microservices. It's like, no, that's really not a good move. But there's where are the blog posts, not for and now the pendulum swings back, and there are lots of posts now about how monoliths are making a return and how they're the way to go, and so hopefully the beginners come and see those posts. But when you're learning and everyone's saying, oh, you must use a microservice architecture, it's like, hang on.
Yeah, because the people who are knowledgeable are writing about their day job. They're not writing about spinning up a Django app on a weekend.
Yeah.
Which is possible,
Yeah.
and you can deploy it too, which we could. Should we get into that deployment?
Well, I do want to just point out, I think this might be the article that I read
I've seen that
before.
one.
Like
Yeah,
you're not Google, you're not LinkedIn, you're not Facebook, you're not Netflix. There are people who actually, that's an inaccurate statement about. There's plenty of people that work at those companies. But like you said, Carlton, the people who come along, they see these companies who they respect and say they must be doing it right. And so often with these deployment stories, with these design patterns, should you have like separate caching servers that run like something like Redis? Yes, you should. No, you shouldn't. And that's the right answer at the same time, but with the context that you need, right? Are you trying to run 10,000 servers and let 500 people work on this project? Or are you 2 people trying to do a startup? Like those are not the same trade-offs and balances you want to make, right?
Right. Yeah, and it depends as well on your model. So one example that I really like is Stack Overflow. Now they're built entirely on the Microsoft stack, so they've got SQL Server and they're using .NET, but the basic point is they've got a really big database, and then a few worker processes in front of those, and that's it. It's a classic monolith, and they're one of the biggest sites on the internet, and yet they're
incredibly fast.
Yeah, and exactly as fast as you could ever want. Okay, they do it in this kind of monolith, old school style, vertical scale. Make it just bigger. Like, don't spin out parallels. Just make the thing bigger. Buy a bigger database server. So that's you're not going to be bigger than Stack Overflow, right? And then another example we had.
And when you'll reevaluate it anyway. Whatever you do now is not going to solve that problem. Yeah.
But you're not going to be bigger than Stack Overflow. And then we had another example, which was Docker on Demand. They came on, Matt Lehman from Docker on Demand came on Django Chat recently. And he was, they've got a more containerized approach to it. But the thing is, they're doing peer-to-peer communication between many simultaneous peer-to-peer video communications, because Docker on Demand is like a telemedicine,
right. Like I need to book a video appointment with my doctor.
Yeah, exactly. And but they've got so many of those processes needed to be spun up that they need something which scales out and then back down again very easily. So they've got a kind of more like modern, more a cooler technology. The cool technology. They're not as big as Stack Overflow probably in terms of raw talent, raw traffic, but they need that flexibility of architecture.
That's what we always say, Carlton, right? We say it depends. That's our tagline for our podcast.
It depends.
Yeah.
Django,
it depends. Exactly. That's your subtitle.
I
do context, right? When people talk about design patterns, deployment, architecture, those are always within a silent, not mentioned most of the time, context in which that makes sense. And you got to decide, are you in that context or are you not?
No, entirely.
Yeah.
Now, before we move on, go ahead, Will.
I was just saying, what problems are you trying to solve? Like, you can't innovate everywhere. Like, there's so many pieces to a website. Do you want to innovate on deployment? Not until you're, Instagram, I don't think.
Yeah, absolutely.
Sorry. That's all.
No, well, I think that's a great point. And, it's when you're small, the most important thing is adding features and going quick, right? When you get bigger, the most important thing is to not go down, right? If random little project that is like an ordering service for a restaurant in Milwaukee, if it goes down for half an hour, it's not ideal, but it's not the end of the world. If Google goes down for half hour, people really notice. It's like front page news type. So it's just a totally different thing. Now, before we move on to a more deployment stuff, and we're kind of in there. I do, just before we get away too far, maybe we could touch real quickly on some of the new features that are coming in 3.2 and the Django 3 stuff that you guys are excited about.
Yeah, maybe can you start with just 3 in general, Carlton? Because I think that makes 3.2 have more context.
Well, okay. So, but 3 3 began the process for making Django async, right? So we added, so historically Python has this, the WSGI, the web service gateway interface. So Django is a WSGI framework. Flask is a WSGI framework. It was this standard so that application servers could talk to protocol servers, which could talk to the internet without, each framework having to have its own protocol server. So Gunnicorn
Right.
is a WSGI server, and it can speak to Flask, and it can speak to Django.
Right.
It
You can
speak
use
to
that,
any
and I
other
can
WSGI
use
server.
MicroWSGI, and
Yeah.
it's we don't have to coordinate or do anything. It just happens. That's
Yeah, so
because of the WSGI or WSGI thing, right?
Yeah. Yes. So that's the standard. And so in order to make things async, there's this thing called ASGI, which is the asynchronous web gateway interface. I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't really. Yeah, right.
Anyway, it's not WSGI, it's ASGI. So first of all, Django 3.0 brought in an ASGI handler. So it wasn't async at all, but you could run it under an ASGI server. And then 3.1 brought in actual async views, and you can define an async def view, and you can use, I don't know, HTTPX, which is like an asynchronous HTTP client.
It's like request 3.
Yeah, it's
Right.
like
Or
requests.
yeah, what about what's the ORM story? Does that support async and await yet?
Right. No, so that's not there yet. So this is
Right.
something that will develop probably over the course of the Django 4 lifestyle. So there's plans and there's thoughts, and we need to get to the point where with the ORM, where you can down to your kind of filter call, and so things like filter, they can be totally synchronous because they don't actually do any IO. They don't actually hit the database. But when you then go, right, I've got my query set and I'm going to iterate it, and I'm going to fetch the objects from
Right.
the database. We need that bit, even if the actual connection is running a thread or whatever, we need that bit to be fully async. And then Django will feel async as it is. At the moment, if you write an async view in Django, you kind of have to say, well, I'm not going to touch the DB. I'm not going to, I mean,
Yeah.
you can wrap the ORM in a sync to async wrapper, but
Yeah.
you kind of lose the point at that.
Yeah. But that's coming, right?
Yeah. So Andrew Godwin, who's driving this effort, he gave a talk at DjangoCon Europe about the structuring of this and what it's going to look like, and it's like, yeah, that makes sense. This is gonna work, and we don't have to get. What's nice is we don't have to get async all the way down to the very bottom, because we can we can sort of hand off the actual database connection in a thread executor, but from the outside of the ORM, it will look async, and then you can stream out your content records of maximum throughput as you want to, that kind of thing.
Yeah. Well, the fact that you can already do external APIs, and if you're going down the microservice path, you can do your microservice calls with HTTPX and await those. That's already a huge step.
Yeah, exactly. So this is without, and this works. What's amazing about the way Andrew is just absolute hero, but he put it together in such a way that you can run this with a WSGI server. So you're running Django 3.1 with Gunnicorn, like you always have.
Yeah.
And you think to yourself, I just need to make a couple of API calls, but they're quite slow and I want to make them in parallel. You can do that just by writing an async def call and then, making the parallel calls using HTTPX, say. And it just works. And Django does all the rest for you and adapts it. And you didn't have to change your application server. You didn't have to do, it's just like,
right.
Async.
One of the challenges, if you're talking to the database, is you say, okay, fine. The bottleneck was we were waiting at the web server level, at the Django level. And then we're going to push that down to the database. We're going to just make all that async. All of a sudden, all the pressure is now on the database, which can be a problem. But if you're talking external APIs, you're now pushing the pressure onto the internet, which is way scalable.
Yeah, and it's always going to scale more than you, right? Like, you're not going to need that many client requests probably.
Yeah.
I mean,
also, David Smith out there says 3.2 will be a great release. You guys have done a great job getting many patches over. Yeah, for sure.
Thank you, David. That's super. We're working really hard. We had too long a list, and we got, one we had to bump for Django 4.0, but the rest we got in. So we were very pleased.
Okay, so 3.0 async and await. This is a big deal.
And so those are the big features for 3.0. And then what's coming in 3.2? We've got various other bits and bobs. You can customize primary key. So traditionally they've just been autofilled, which is in 32. Well, eventually, if you get 22 billion of those or something, you can run out. So you can now customize that for big in. And over the next couple of releases, major releases, we will make the default big in, because that's probably what it should be in 64, because then you're never going to run out of primary keys. But that's something that, you know, came in. The big sites run into that, especially if you start creating, I don't know, events, an event log. You know, a site can generate a lot of events and they can add up quickly, you know. So anyway, that's important. Functional indexes in the ORM, so you can create an index on an expression, like, you know, that these were greater than, or that the sum of this was, and then you can query on those at full speed because they're indexed. That's a really big
really?
feature.
So you can do a query like the sum of the orders of the customer is greater than $100, and that's a relationship.
And then you can create an index on that value, and you've been able to do that in raw SQL for, you know, any amount of time, but that's now exposed at the ORM level, and that's nice.
That's awesome.
Just
that for people who are doing reporting or that kind of thing, that's massive.
And then we've got, I don't know, a new Memcache backend for the cache. We've got, you know, updating the API for using the admin, for nice decorator API for creating various admin customizations. We've got themes in the admin. We're going to ship a dark theme.
That's a big one for people will see right away, anyways. Because the Django admin could use a refresh, and there's been all sorts of third-party ways to customize it, but now be built in a bit more.
That'd be cool.
All sorts. In the blog post for the alpha, I described it as a mescla of new features, and that's exactly what it is. But what's nice is there aren't, apart from async, which is coming, there aren't any new major features in Django, right? It's 15 years old. It's rich and mature and largely feature complete. But each major release, each 8 months, it always amazes me when we're drawing up the final release notes, how much depth and extra substance there is in the features that we've managed to add and that have been contributed over that 8-month period.
Yeah, that's fantastic.
I don't have anything to add, Carlton.
Well, one thing I did want to, one thing that I comes to mind. So I feel like you're capturing much of the modern Python awesomeness. One other area that's, I think, interesting, I have no idea what your plans are around it, but maybe you could just give us your thoughts, is type hints and type annotations.
Yep. That's difficult for us.
Carl, about that a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, that's difficult for us because Django, I mean, if you take the ORM, it's super dynamic. And there's an amazing project, Django Stubs, where they've got stub files and they've got, you know, they've done a super job, and it really does work well. So if you load up VS Code or PyCharm these days, you get very good autocomplete around things like Django model field definitions. And that's all powered by Django Stubs.
A year or so, my type hints underneath, right?
Yeah, it totally is. A year or so ago, there was some discussion about whether we would make those inline hints in Django itself, and the technical board at the time said no, because we need the typing technology to evolve a little bit further in Python itself before Django can jump on and say, look, we endorse this particular technology. There's various ways of doing it, and various type hinting, type checkers, and so say we favored MyPy, which is obviously the endorsed one. Well, what about the others? You know, we can't support them all, and they might change. And
PyWrite and all the different various initiatives.
And we can't take it out once it's in. The thing with the reason why people love Django is because it's super stable. You know, you write a site 5 years later, you don't really have to do very much to keep it going. And so the technical board at the time said, no, we're not going to bring those type hints into Django, but that will be reviewed. You know, we'll look at it again in a little while's time. One thing I will say about typing, in all the PEPs, it says type hints are to remain optional. They're not meant to be compulsory, even by convention, right? And I do feel, maintaining Django, a certain pressure to have them. I do worry that optionality of type hints is perhaps undermined a little bit in the day-to-day development. I'm not sure. I mean, because I also code in Swift, right, which is a fully statically typed.
Swift is pretty strong in its syntax. Like, you can't even null out objects. Even if they could be, right, if they're not allowed to be optional explicit. There's a lot of interesting stuff happening in the Swift type.
I mean, Swift is a fantastic language, but there's no option, right? It's type hints or it's type annotations all the way. And then when I come back to Python after a few hours of that, I'm like, this is so
I know.
breathtaking.
You know, the thing that I really, the comparison that I make a lot is between TypeScript, which is type annotations for JavaScript, and Python type hints. And I always walk away from TypeScript feeling like, that was way harder than it should have been. Why was it so frustrating and fighting me? Whereas in Python, you might get some squigglies because you didn't quite define something just right, or it wasn't defined at all. But then it carries on, right? Whereas things that are completely, it must work within this context, they can become challenging. Especially the reason I bring up TypeScript is the stuff that it brings in is not necessarily typed, just like Python. Whereas Swift is end to end, it's all from scratch under that same system, so it's coherent. But bringing in, say, jQuery into TypeScript, like there's no TypeScript jQuery. I know there's like stubs you can put on and whatnot, but like that kind of stuff is more Python-like. And so I think it's pretty interesting.
Yeah, and Django's very much in that boat where it was never written with type hints in mind.
Yeah, of course they didn't exist.
And if you look at Django stubs, it's awesome, but a lot of the things are like string or any, and it's like, but that's horrible, right? You don't want to write that every single time. So that's an issue. And then another thing I see, which I'm not sure about, is sometimes they make a type like a model, the Django model admin. They make it a generic that takes the model type, which tells you what it's the admin of. And I remember, and I look at that. And
you're like back to C++ templates or something, right?
Yeah. And I see where they're going with that, and it's amazing what they've been able to do there. But I remember coding Objective-C UI table views, say, and what you would always do is you get your object, your row class in from the UI table view delegate, where you're getting a list of cells, right? So like a list of email messages, and you'd immediately cast it to the type you wanted so that you knew what you were dealing with. And in a way, when I get something back from a model admin method, I'm quite happy to write : model name, to tell the editor what it's meant to be, to tell the type checker what it's meant to be. And then for the rest of the method, I get the autocomplete.
And you probably don't put any more type hints because it's just now flows. And it's, I agree, it's so good at allowing you to generate code incredibly fast if the tool supports it. One quick comment or thought that before we move on, this having types around the ORM is really interesting because all the big ORMs seem to do the same basic flow. I'm thinking, Django ORM, SQL Alchemy, even NoSQL ones like Mongo Engine, which I use, they all have a class which has the columns defined as descriptors. So at definition time, they create the tables or the collections, and then at runtime, they become the scalar versions of the thing they say they are, right? A integer column is now actually an integer. So what I've done when I define the model class is say like name : stir equals string column. And so the Python thinks it's all the types are actually what I said, the primary types, like in the model. And then the underlying ORM can do what it needs to do. But, the rest of my code is like, that's a float column right there, or float field. That's been really helpful. I don't know. I haven't run into any problems doing that, but it's been pretty helpful.
Yeah. I mean, it's the thing that brings to mind, there's data classes, right? Which they brought in 3.7 or 3.8.
Yeah.
And then Pydantic is the other exciting thing. So you define a model, call it a model, with exactly this. It's like field name type with an annotation string or int or whatever. And that works really well. And I could imagine us generating Django ORM models from that kind of thing. But then you end up needing options, like is it nullable, or is it is it required, is it, what validators does this field have? And then it starts, when you start to add validators, it starts to look almost like what we've got now. I mean, Pydantic's got one good advantage in raw serialization speed. It's very fast, so that's something we can learn. But the short answer is I don't know, but it's exciting times, isn't it?
It's very exciting times. All right, let's talk really quickly about maintaining your content or things that you generate. Like you guys all write articles, books, do online stuff, even podcasts. So 3.2 is out. what broke? Like real quickly, Will, maybe you want to just talk about what you've been doing to,
Yeah,
you've
there's a
printed
reason why
book.
there's very few up-to-date Django books, because the release cycle of every 9 months doesn't overlap with the traditional publisher cycle. So for me, I mean, I'm on version, I think 5 for most of the books. So
Yeah.
I was on 110 or 111. So it's sort of like writing the book again every time. I basically go through from scratch, and because all the code is linked to the text. Because I'm self-published, I can do all that. I have my flow down. So really I have a kind of a list of new features I know that are in there. So I'll play around with them to make sure that things don't break. And then I'm constantly emailing with readers, so I have feedback on kind of what works and what doesn't. So half the new features are fixing things so it's smooth, and then half just making the text. So at this point, I feel pretty good about the flow of all three. And people will say, "What about this?" And maybe I can explain it a little bit better. So for 3.1 added in the beginner's book, I really wanted to have proper deployments, but not go as deep as I do in the professional book. So I did introduce environment variables and showed, I think, a pretty elegant way to get environment variables and to have some lockdown for the deployed site. Whereas before in beginners, it was just sort of like the local version, which is pretty open, was what you deployed, because it was more about getting something up. But I was able to introduce environment variables. We could talk about that more. There's a third-party package that's great. So that's always the tension for me, is showing and telling, right? Like I want to explain everything, but I don't want to overwhelm people, and so that's part of the thing I have to think about for 3.1. So I don't know.
I think also for Django being so stable, at least you can say all the stuff is still the same. There's just new features we haven't mentioned, or a new way maybe is better, but as opposed to this does not work anymore.
Well, it's the difference between what trips a professional programmer and someone who's new. So for example, in 3.1, the pathlib was added when you create a new Django project, the settings.py file, which is the default settings. The way the routes are done is a little bit different. It's like a 2-minute Stack Overflow thing for someone who's used to using Django or used to breaking stuff. But that can completely derail a beginner. So there's usually a couple things like that. So in that case, like I have a dedicated blog post because I knew that was coming, and just this morning I got more questions around it. So that's sort of the thing that's fun to me, is figuring out how do I, be compassionate to the true beginners, but how to people who are more further along.
Yeah, absolutely.
So yeah, so it's not a lot. It's a lot of work to do. I don't know how you could do it with traditional public.
Yeah, I don't either. I was just dealing with some GitHub issues on some folks who are having trouble because a mismatch of pip upgrades and other packages, and it's just how it goes. Real quick, John from the live stream's really excited about the admin themes, so that's really cool that it's going to come along.
Yeah.
All right,
let's cool.
They add up to greatness. I think I love that.
Yeah, that's a great say. All right, let's spend some time. We talked a lot about deployment already, which is why I've been dancing around a bit. But let's go ahead and talk about deployment. So when I create a web application with Django, or really honestly with Flask or anything, I've got a cool app, but it's web apps are not generally meant for the individual. They are meant to go on the internet and be amazing and connect things and allow other people to do stuff. And that's a huge gap, right? So maybe I've just learned how to do Django. You just talked about your beginner's book, Will. And I've finally got that one page that wouldn't show, and the database stopped, crashing when I did that one query because I checked for none now, and it's all good. Wait, I have to learn Linux and I have to become an admin? And like, what the heck just happened, right? So how do you guys approach that? What do you tell that person?
Yeah, first of all, hand on shoulder, I feel you, right? Because it's just there's this massive deployment gap. Like we've got the Django tutorial, we've got the Django Girls tutorial, we've got the Django REST framework tutorial. People have done those. They've got their app together. They've come up with some ideas. They've learned a teeny bit of JavaScript to make it that bit better, and now put it online. And exactly this, I've got to learn Linux. Oh my word!
Among other things. I mean, it's two things though, right? I think
DNA.
Like when I think about this. Well, there's two ways to think about it. One is making a environment friendly, which we can talk about. And then there's the specifics of, do I do it on a VPS? Do I do it on a pass? So those are two separate things. The first one, I think we can generalize, and Django has some good notes on that. The second one is sort of a deep end of opinion, I guess.
Yeah.
Though I'm in favor of, like, I use Heroku. I'm a big fan of platforms. If somebody had something that like hosted AWS for Django, I would use that.
Well, yeah. I mean, so, and I'm just going to throw it in here now. I'm working on an app for this exact problem. It's called Button. It's btn.dev, and the idea is to be able to spin up a small environment for this exact. I just want to get my app online use case without you having to become a sysadmin expert.
Yeah. So the spectrum looks like to me, PaaS. Right.
Yeah.
Platform as a service, which you said you like Heroku, and there's other options as well. Then I think maybe Button is even before that. I'm not entirely sure. Like,
well,
in terms of
Button. So, okay. So let me jump in. You've got the platforms, you've got Heroku, which is there at one end, and that's kind of like, they'll run your app, but they don't, that's it, right? Or you can run another worker instance, but then you say to yourself, oh, I just want to put a file online. It's like, well, how on earth do I do that? I can't. Or I want to put up a static website, so I've got to bring in, I don't know, Netlify, because another service.
Yeah, Netlify is really nice for just pure static sites, actually. Yeah,
it is. It's awesome. But then all of a sudden you're running two services, and then you want to do some log analysis. So you've got to bring in, and it's like, oh, hang on, I've got 3 services now running, and it gets a bit out of hand. So then on the other hand, you've got AWS, and you go to AWS, and it's like, oh my word. It's
the paradox of choice. It's just like that and Azure. I mean, they're both incredibly powerful, but it's just like, oh my goodness, look at this admin dashboard. Like there's this huge thing with 50 choices. I go into one and it expands into 20, and then I need to figure out the right one of those 20. It's mind boggling.
Yeah, exactly. And so where Button fits in that is it's on AWS, but it provides a very simplified environment. This is because it's part tool. It's a tool to do it, but also a guide that says, look, this is how you should deploy. So the app puts together the environment for how you should deploy your Django app. Or you can do any app, but I begin with Django because that's where obviously what I know. And then the difference between, well, why would I use that instead of a platform as a service like Heroku? Well, because if you grow out of it, it's just AWS, and so you can go on and move on to other things. Then you can
when you do go closer to, now you are kind of Google or whatever. I mean, obviously
you've got a growth
not
path.
far down that road, but little ways you can go, oh, we actually need to do this other thing.
Yeah. And so that's what I'm aiming for, and that's launching very soon. It'll be early access by the middle of February, beta by end of the quarter, and then what I call what ends the beta, I don't know, end of the year, I would imagine.
Yeah that sounds really cool. We'll definitely link to it in the show notes. When I was pausing there, I said, okay, well, on one end we have PaaS like Heroku and other platform as a service options. What is the other end? Is the other end Linux virtual machines, or is the other end Kubernetes clusters?
No, it's Kubernetes clusters. It's well beyond virtual machines, right? So, like, to spin up a virtual machine is not a problem. The problem is that you get a bare OS, and then you've got to do all the app to get installed to turn it into to something you can deploy on, right? And then you do that once, and then the second problem is that 6 months later you need to upgrade it, and you've got to replace that VM. So that's very difficult, and I think that's what leads people into this kind of world of containers. And then into containers, it's like, oh well, I need an orchestration platform and that's, there are people who make a career doing that.
Yeah.
You can't expect to do that.
Yeah, I agree with Carlton. I will say it depends slightly in that, like, so in my professionals book, I show how to use Docker, and Docker is, for a smaller site, I think actually you can just put your containers online, so you can, in a lot of different, I think Flow is actually quite nice. But I agree with Carlton's broader point about, Kubernetes and all the rest. It's
so to me, I feel like, sorry, Carlton, I feel like is the goal. I'm setting up a Kubernetes cluster and I'm running the data layer and I'm running the caching layer. And I'm like, if you're managing that whole thing in a cluster, you're at the far right end of the most complicated. But if I'm going to deploy to a hosted Kubernetes container and consume a database as a service and a caching tier as a service, then it starts to fall back to, well, I just get my container to run and plug in these connection strings and we're good to go. I think it can kind of live on both sides, honestly.
Yeah, I mean, and there's different approaches and different sweet spots for each individual. The difference for me is you can containerize your application and run it up, but where do you container that to? Where do you run that container? Is that on a set of VMs which you provisioned yourself and put a container management system on, like Kubernetes, or is that on somebody else? Like, is it basically servers like Cloud Run? Cloud Run takes your container and runs it, and you don't know anything about where it's running. So that's more like a platform as a service again.
Yeah, it is. It falls back in that. So Will said he's a fan of Heroku. Carlton, let me ask you this question. If you were writing an application in Django that was expected to get 5 million data-driven, like proper requests, not for CSS and whatnot, but proper requests a month, how would you deploy it right now?
I would deploy it on a pretty big VM with as many process workers as I need. So I'd stick Nginx as my front end. Perhaps I'd probably use something like application load balancer in front of it, one of these things that AWS will provide, or Azure have got their equivalent load balancer. Then I'd have my Nginx, which is serving my static files. Behind that, I'd probably have.
It's also doing SSL, for example, right? Your Let's Encrypt.
And they're handling all of the certificate renewals and all of that kind of things, which is probably worth the money because it only takes you a few minutes, but you forget, and then your site goes down, and just handle that stuff off. So I'd put that on a nice size VM. I'd have 3, 4, 5 Gunnercorn workers, serving the application instances, load balanced behind Nginx, and then I'd have Postgres on a decent size RDS, which is a managed database service behind it. And I would as a first preference, I would scale up the VM and I would scale up the RDS rather than
way before you scale out.
Yeah, way before I scale out.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, if you can throw money at it, then do it.
Yeah. As soon as you have them scaled out, it gets tricky, right? You become it takes you up a notch in that DevOps story.
Yeah, and then you need, at that point you're hiring an extra hand just to manage the ops, and it's like, well, what was the revenue of the application that justified the salary and the social security of that extra hand?
Yeah, I mean, maybe you're like, well, I don't really want to pay for that larger VM that's $80 a month instead of $10 a month. But if the alternative is now we spend human hours on making 3 $10 VMs run, it's so easy for businesses to become penny wise, pound foolish around these kinds of things, right? It's just like, well, we can't get you a new monitor, a new keyboard. Like, really? You pay me like $80,000 a year and you won't give me a new keyboard to be more productive? Or I feel like that's the deployment equivalent of that.
Yeah, no, it's penny pinching for no reason. I mean, the other great example is Sentry, right? So Sentry is your kind of you log all your errors to it, send your exceptions to it, and it gives you great stack traces and it links it back to GitHub. It's awesome. Why would you not have this? And then you're on the free account, it give you 5,000 events a month or something, and it's like, oh, we need $30 to get onto the million events a month, and the manager's like, no, you can't have paid Sentry. You're like, what are you talking about? So
exactly.
You're like, well, we can't log that event because of Sentry, and then you're blind, and then your app goes down, and you spend 4 hours trying to work out what it is while you're losing business. Like, that was $30 a month for Sentry. Just pay it.
But I think it depends if your manager has felt that pain as an individual contributor themselves. Right, because if they haven't, then stop complaining, developer.
Yeah, exactly.
But you should. I always thought. I mean, and at Quizlet, which is now like half of all high school students, we had Joyent, which are they still around? They're a hosting company, but we were having scaling issues. They came in and we had the whole team, CTO, which was great. And at the end of the day, they were just like, you need bigger hardware.
Get more hardware.
If you can get more, and as a business person, if you can throw money at a scaling problem, that's the easiest money you've spent.
I think one thing. So what I'm doing right now, Carlton, is I'm running Nginx on Ubuntu, but I'm using MicroWSGI. And I came across this, although as I'm starting to think about the ASGI stuff, Gunicorn, and like UVicorn worker processes is starting to look like a really awesome thing. But what I wanted to point out is there's this great article by the Bloomberg Tech folks talking about configuring MicroWhiskey for production. And man, do they have a bunch of good little tips of like, well, here's all these things, but oh, did you know if you turn on like enable threads versus not, or if you set single interpreter mode to true, you automatically get better performance because it was configured to potentially run like Python 3.7 and 3.8 at the same time, and you're never going to do that in one process most likely. And there's just all these really fantastic settings and like vacuum and whatnot to clean up sockets and whatnot. So people, if they're running MicroWhiskey in production, they should absolutely check that out. That's a really, I redid a bunch of the way I was doing things after reading that one.
Just scroll to the image at the top if you would, please, Michael. The little diagram that they have.
Yeah.
But like, so that looks almost exactly how I deploy. Like Nginx in front of a worker process, that's running your Python applications and, talking to your database.
Yeah, exactly. It's pretty standard.
Yeah, they got memcached in there, so I'd have Redis instead of memcache, but same deal.
Yeah. Let me ask you. Yeah, go ahead, Will.
I just say there's a comment about does EC2 sit between a VPS and Kubernetes? Yeah, Kubernetes. Since you're AWS expert.
Okay, so, I don't know about expert, but
more than I am.
So, but on AWS, like this is what I haven't found in AWS. Like, I would love their Lightsail product, but it just seems totally uncared, where they kind of manage the cluster all for you. But on the I can't even remember what the cluster service is called, but you have to provision the EC2 instances. And you can do it quite easily. It's not hard to do, but you have to spin those up, and they're kind of your responsibility. And then it will run the cluster service on top of it, the Kubernetes on top of it, and then you deploy your containers in there. This is where something like Cloud Run is a bit easier because you don't have that layer of I'm provisioning the underlying instances myself, and you have to choose the size of them, and you can scale them up easily enough. But it's non-trivial to set up a cluster on AWS.
That's always been my feeling as well. I also feel like you're sort of committed to their hosted services, and if for some reason you don't want to use them, it's that the step is not a tiny bit more. It's a much bigger step to like try to rework that.
Yeah, I mean, the example is you can run your own Postgres on EC2 instances, when you can provision the disks and you can do all that rather than RDS. And for me, I'm like, okay, if you've got a very specialist use case, then do that. But RDS is great. Just use RDS. Just use the hosted service, because again, you're saving money. And it's a bit more expensive per hour, but not as expensive as your time, your life force.
Yeah. Well, I think also it depends, right? Are you one single person who is building up an idea and you have zero revenue and you're just trying to do this for 2 hours a week to see if you can get a little tiny bit of traction? Maybe it is worth an extra 5 hours, right? Versus I have actual money coming in the door and I'm trading off building this feature or that feature. Like, those are really very different contexts. In which,
and also though, you get yourself a Raspberry Pi and you can install Nginx on it and Postgres on it, but you can run all those, right? And you can do it locally, and you can run a Apache bench against it, and it will serve plenty. So you can get not the Nano one. Too? But sure. But you can run Postgres, is my point. You don't need RDS to run a small Postgres.
Right.
But if you're running a slightly bigger one, then use RDS. And then if you're a specialist and you really need to customize your Postgres somehow, then spin up the EC2, install Postgres on it, and customize it to your heart's content. But that's well beyond my skill level, and
Yeah.
But this is why they have hundreds or thousands of employees, right? Like, when people say, why do the big companies do that? It's like, well, why does Instagram have 1,000 engineers when, Carlton, you and I could spin up a prototype relatively quickly? It's like, because we're not dealing with the traffic they are. And so it just gets exponentially harder, which is why you need a lot of people for all these issues.
Yeah, absolutely. Will, you mentioned something really interesting there that I would like to just touch on for a moment.
Okay.
We're getting short on time.
I'm ready.
You said you could run SQLite.
Oh, well, so that Carlton has a good story about SQLite. I mean, about how it's so generally people say, well, you can't use it, you shouldn't use it at all. But there are some cases where that's not the case. I mean, if it's a read heavy application, you can probably get away with it. Simon Wilson's doing a lot with Dataset.
I just had him on the show. His episode just came out this week, actually. Yeah. So he's great. And that is such a cool project. I feel like that is actually an undersold story for the beginners, right? Because deployment of web application often means deployment of web application plus database server plus backups of database server plus all of a sudden it goes from 20% to 90% hard or whatever, right? Or you go to hosted and you're like, okay, well, I still got to back up that thing potentially, and there's just you've got potential migrations. I don't know. There's a lot of stuff going on, and if you can say, well, until you actually get much traffic, you can just say, here's the DB file and the SQLite connection on the one machine that I have, and you back up that file every now and then. That might be a good story if the alternative is it's too much for me to get my app out.
Yeah, no, definitely. Especially if it's a blog or a content site like a shop catalog where it's all read only, and maybe you're using the admin to manage the content on it. If it's only one person using the admin, you're not going to have concurrent writes, which is the thing about SQLite, and so it's never going to be an issue. And it is fast. It's fast at read only workloads. It's fast. It's fast enough.
It's very fast. Yeah.
And then
there's no server for people who don't understand or are not totally aware. Like it comes with Python and it runs in process. There's no other server to set up and connect to.
Yeah. So Carlton corrected me on that at one point because I was saying, oh yeah, no SQLite, and he was. So I have to give credit to Carlton for. There are some instances it depends, or it can work.
Here's the secret about SQLite. It's got a write-ahead log, a WAL mode, which means that actually you've got a good chance of being able to do kind of concurrent writes too. And if the Django's ORM has got a retry value, which if you set that, a little bit higher, if it gets database locked, it will try again in a second. And then, you can go quite a long way enabling these things. And then when you finally in production actually get a database was locked error, then you could think, do you know what? I think it's time we move to Postgres.
Yeah. In my world, I'm running MongoDB as the database, and it doesn't make sense to consider running that on SQLite. But I can remember back when I first started deployment, like, okay, well, I got to learn Linux, I got to learn Nginx, I got to learn MicroWhiskey. Like, okay, what other deployment? Like, how do I have to learn running my database on these things? There was a lot, and I can definitely see if you could say, well, here's an intermediate step to get it out and get it going, and then you just change the connection string at some point over to a big separate server. I think that's a really good path.
It's a little bit like raw SQL versus Django models. This is timely because I've had a thread emailing with a reader who doesn't quite has something in mind, and he's like, I modeled it all out, the schema all out in SQL, and it's like SQL is easy to learn the basics and really hard to scale. And while Django lets you write SQL, you really, really, really should resist doing that unless you're way better programmer than I am. So whereas before you would have to learn tons of stuff, so the same thing with deployment, you can get a lot of the way there by trusting someone who says them until you need it, don't bother. The same thing with database stuff. It's like, okay, do some basic SQL, understand a little bit of the relations, but that's the power of the Django ORM, is that it will handle so much of this for you. And if you think you need to go custom, unless, if you have any doubts, you shouldn't do it.
Yeah. And the migration side, that's a huge part of a challenge if you were maintaining it yourself.
Yeah. I mean, that was, Andrew was responsible for we're doing a lot of the async stuff now.
Nice. All right, guys, we're getting short on time, but I do want to just really quickly cover one more thing. Server's up and running. Feels like it works. I watched it all day. It was fine. I want to walk away from my desk. I want to know that it's probably still fine. And to me, like Carlton, you already talked about one thing. There's some really great monitoring services that you integrate at the API level, like you plug in as a library to your code. Sentry being one of them. They're really great. They sponsored the show for a while, so thanks for that as well. But I use Sentry on, yeah, they're great, and I've got Sentry running on my apps, and every now and then I'll get an email. And at this point, when I first integrated that type of service, I got a lot of, oh, I didn't know that was happening. Oh crap, I'm gonna have to fix that.
Well, that's why there's levels of logging and stuff, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And but once I kind of dialed in, now it's more like, well, somebody tried to send like some binary hacky thing that broke the URL parsing, but it's not really a problem. It's just right. But having that thing there is really important, I think.
Yes, absolutely. Sentry, I just can't see a reason not to use it. Even that, they've got the free plan. Why wouldn't you have that?
The free tier, like once you run out, you can decide whether or not you want to pay for it. But at least get us some kind of insight into the errors that are happening.
Yeah, and then the other thing that I'm a fan of is Prometheus. It takes a teeny bit of setting up, but again, you can get yourself a Raspberry Pi and you can play with that locally, and it's not that hard. You can put it on your Mac or you put it on your Windows machine; it will run. But get a Raspberry Pi, set it up, monitor the device. Prometheus is good fun. There's a dashboard that goes with it called Grafana, and then they do a log thing called Locky, which it's you have to configure it yourself, but it teaches you about your application. You have to say, okay, I want to monitor this, and then you can put a couple of tags in, and then okay, you get metrics then for that bit. So perhaps you've got a slow view. So one thing you can do is you can put on your Nginx logs, you can log the upstream response time. So you've handed off to Garnicorn or to MicroWhiskey, and Nginx will then log how long those responses took. And then you can say, well, actually, those responses to that particular request is taking a long time. And then on that request, you can go into that view and you can add a little bit of instrumentation. And then you can start getting metrics for what that view is doing. And
that's really good.
Why I want Carlton to build his thing so he can do this for me.
He does it for all of you guys. Yeah, I'm also a fan of Datadog. I think those sound pretty similar.
Oh yeah,
okay.
They do. I think they're Boston based actually, but yeah, they do a good job.
I think nice.
And so there's APM, application process monitoring,
exactly.
Right? So there's quite a lot of commercial solutions, and then Prometheus is the sort of DIY
nice
equivalent.
Nice. Okay, cool. So that's the errors and performance. The other side is just the website is down, right? So maybe there's so many different layers and moving parts. For example, like we have very little downtime with our training courses and stuff, but one thing that did happen is we have this thing that will take the main IP address and switch it to a failover server so we can do reboots and patches, and then it'll switch it back. And that's all done through an API, through like a get push, and then it all just sort of goes down the chain. Well, at one point there was a bug where that switch of the IP like disassociated it with either server. So the server thought it was fine. It's like, whoa, things are chill, right?
Right, so you log in, and it's like,
but the site was just timing out, or so I don't remember what happened, but it wasn't good. So I think there's some really nice uptime monitoring things that are free that people should just plug in to go hit these 3 pages just to see. I can talk to the site, it talks to the database, and answer comes back.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I've got those configured. I know we're almost out of time. I did want to mention on deployment, I think one thing that trips people up, especially around Django, is static files, which is something, if you're doing it, VPS, and I think the key thing is that your server doesn't want to run your static files. Like it can, there's ways to do it, but so both within Django out of the box defaults to local settings, and the Django has a local server that'll just run your static files. To put that in deployment, you would run collect static, which is a command that makes a single static file, and you probably want to use something like white noise, but there's a couple steps there, but something that really sort of intermediate level Django people, it really trips them up. I have a blog post on that because I forget the commands. There's like 4 things to tweak that you just have to do every time. But it worked locally. Why doesn't it work live? And it's like partly because people don't understand, how their server is working because they don't have to. But that's I just want to.
Awesome.
That's one of the big 4, right? So get your code in place, however you do that, tarball, git pull, whatever you get it there. Configure your virtual environment, so in pip install all your requirements. Configure your database and make sure you connect to that. and get your static files in place. That's the sort
the
of
database is the other one that you know this, Michael. Like beginners, they're like, well, I updated it locally and I pushed my code. Why isn't my production database different? Right? And it is confusing. Like I still occasionally make that mistake. But your code is not your two separate databases.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's what you want as well. Is you want to be able to write your blog post in locally, and then it appear on your server. You don't want to have to go, oh no, now I have to paste it into the admin on my remote thing.
Yeah, it depends how automated you want to go. I mean, for a simple, so my Learn Django site, which is basically one admin, largely a content site. I mean, in terms of easy peasy, it's just Django, and then I've got Cloudflare in front and it's done. It's super fast. I get decent amount of traffic. I don't have to think about it. I think I've got PagerDuty, one of those,
and
okay.
Yeah, that's the one that tells you if it's completely unreachable, right?
Yeah, but it's an external one that
Yes, exactly.
To your point, because you can't always trust yourself.
Yeah, there's some interesting ones. I use Statuscake, and it's neat, but there's some one that I heard the Dan Bader was telling me about that would sound a lot nicer, but I'm like, but this one's already set up. It's not that important. I get notifications if it goes.
That's
down.
all this stuff, right? It's like it's plumbing, right? Like I'm happy to let.
We have the new silver pipes. Like, my bronze pipe's fine. I'm just gonna leave it.
Yeah.
Well, that's Docker for Carlton's, so.
I use Docker loads.
You're a secret Docker user? Yeah. All right.
No, all the time.
All right, let's just wrap it up really quick. There's a Django newsletter. I learned about that. That's interesting. You guys want to just mention that exists?
Yeah. So that's something I run with Jeff Triplett, who's partner at RevSys. He's a Python board member, very involved with Django. So Django-news.com. There wasn't a regular Django newsletter, there wasn't a podcast. So he and I have been doing that for a little over a year, and has projects, articles. I sort of wish someone else did it so I didn't have to do it, but we got a lot of people using it, so that's a good resource for the community.
Yeah, fantastic. All right, so before I let you two out of here, final two questions really quick. Will, I'll go with you first.
Okay.
Notable PyPI package out there that you were like, oh my gosh, I ran across this the other day. I can't believe it.
That's a good question. I'll go back to an old school one, which I think is Bleach, because I've been thinking about a course on forms, and Bleach is a Python one, not Django specific, but you pretty much always want to have that added. Django
this validates like user input to make sure there's no like cross-site scripting type stuff.
Yeah. So that's
okay.
Top of mind. Not a new one, but I think along with white noise, you just got to use it.
Yeah. Awesome.
Carlton probably has something exotic.
Yeah, no, the one that's just really captured my imagination recently is Rich, which is the
Rich is cool.
The library for creating basically nice terminal output, console output, but
it even has like tables and all sorts of stuff. Yeah,
and
it's really neat.
But it's got this inspect functionality where you can get and you're sitting there and you're in the shell and you're like, I want to see it, and you print it and you dear it and you look at the dict and it's not, and then you go inspect and Rich formats this thing where it's like, oh yeah, I can look here and I can see exactly what's going on, and it's just amazing.
Yeah.
20,000. That's what I love about coding, right? I'd never heard of this before, and it's clearly a very established thing.
Yeah, well, I think it's pretty new, but it's taken off quite. Yeah, it's about a year old. It's taken off quite steeply in its adoption. One that I ran across really recently, just throw it out there because it's a Django semi-related one, is Disk Cache. Have you guys heard of that?
No.
So it's a really interesting caching plugin that will, instead of using memory for caching, it will store it onto local disk, because usually have way more hard drive space than you have memory in the cloud, and it plugs into Django to like be a stand-in for the cache there.
Okay, fine. Yeah, I mean, I'm a big fan of file cache in general. It's like memory's expensive, right? So memory cache is the best way, and Redis and Memcache are good ways of doing that all in memory. But then you think, I just want to generate some HTML once and then just pipe it off the hard disk.
Exactly. To me, this is a kind of the equivalent of SQLite versus a real database. It's like you don't need Redis or Memcache or something like completely set up, just like until it gets beyond whatever. Anyway, it looks pretty interesting. All All right, and then
I love that you do these packages things, by the way. Like we include packages every week in Django News, and there's also like an awesome Django repo that Jeff and I do. Because the problem is you want some degree of curation, right? Like something new,
That's
but like
right.
one that's like legit enough to be worth looking at.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks. Yeah, that's very cool. All right, and then final question: if you're going to write some Python code, what editor do you use?
VS Code, same for both of us.
Yeah.
Right, Carlton?
Well,
You're still VS Code?
I have to. Yes, VS Code, very nice. Use it a lot. Also, though, I still like BB Edit.
Yeah, right on. All right. Keeping it old school every now and then, just for a little nostalgia.
I tell you what, right? So I'm using VS Code, and I'm like, but I need to do some transformations, or I need to, do a multi-file search and a diff here. And VS Code's got all that stuff, but it's a bit, this is built in JavaScript, whereas BB Edit's a native Mac app, and it's got a lot going for it.
What do you use,
absolutely.
Michael?
I use PyCharm. Although I
just
did.
think that's also
Yeah,
very cool.
I'm a big fan. Local company here in Portland, Panic, came out with, is it called Nova? I think it's Nova. They just came out with a brand new editor, which looks pretty interesting as well. Yeah.
It
What was their FTP thing that they have? Yeah, they make such
Transmit.
nice
I love Transmit. Yeah, I use it all the time.
Yeah, they make
for
beautiful
S3 stuff.
We were talking about Nova. Yeah.
Fantastic.
Cool.
But I think.
All right, gentlemen, thank you so much for being on the show.
Thank you for having us, Mark.
Yeah, it's been great, and thanks for all the work on Django, and I'll catch up with you all soon.
All right, thanks for having us on.
Thanks for joining us.
Bye-bye.
Thanks everyone for listening as well on the live stream, and I'll stop the